Hi, I'm Ethan. I love muzzleloading. We're heading back to the shop to work on our Kibler Woodsrunner. I took this kit to the NMLRA Spring National Shoot to get some ideas and get some thoughts for some master builders. I've come back with some notes, and now it's time to try to improve this carving a little bit more and get it done. I'm starting out here on the side plate side of the stock and addressing one of the first notes that I got about how much better this would look if I would carve in some of the beaver tails around those inlets on the lock and the side plate side. So something that I was a little nervous about doing and executing on, but across the people I talked to at the spring shoot here, that just kept coming up, that it really should have these beaver tails. We've got the other carving going on, and those beaver tails on the ends just kind of complete this composition, really connecting the middle area of the stock to the rear and then the rear up to the front. With the side plate side done, I begin making these construction lines around the wrist to try to keep my beaver tails even on either side. Now I could get out a micrometer and measure this out, but these construction lines do a fair enough job for me. I'm highlighting the point at the end, I'm highlighting the lowest low in the curve, and I'm identifying the peaks in between to try to balance this out. And you can see me here with my pencil and my eraser getting some rough measurements and a rough idea of these proportions so I can translate it out. Like with all of my kits, I'm really hesitant to get in a hurry, so I step back from the beaver tails after sketching it out and start working on some of the rear carving around the buttstock here. Some of the finer details that a couple folks recommended I try to experiment with. So I'm using a shallow gouge here behind my scrolls to hollow out a little bit of that surface so that we go from the height of our scroll, we kind of fall back as we go back towards the butt plate, and then we rise up ever so slightly as we hit that butt plate, just to give these scrolls a little bit more dimension and to try to make them feel like they're growing out of this stock. This idea connects with a theory and an idea that Ben Query presented to me at the Gunmaker's Hall back porch, that these scrolls aren't just on the buttstock. And when you look at original pieces, if you're able to, if you look at really well done contemporary pieces, you'll see that this scroll that I'm working at the very end of this stock should, on a really nice long rifle, flow up through that cheek rest, down through the wrist, up to the tang, and connect all of those pieces as a composition. It's something I mention a lot when I talk about original pieces, but thinking of these as a composition, I think, helps me and may help you out there consider and find a way to maybe improve a little bit of your building, whether you're building a really simple, affordable kit, or if you're into one of the more expensive, more difficult kits. I really think that thinking of the piece as a whole instead of these little islands of detail around the same piece of wood might be beneficial. Cutting around this section of the stock, I begin to really run into the curl of this wood. It's not an ultra curly stock. I think it's kind of a B tier for a Kibler. So there is still a little bit of curl though. And going across this cheek rest area here, we get to see a little bit of that grain, and with that, the difficulty that comes with carving it. So you can see I'm making really shallow, really controlled cuts where I'm driving with my right hand and supporting with my left thumb. I'm doing this because I'm trying to stay on a surface level and not let that chisel dive any with that grain. You'll see here a little bit later that across the top of that scroll, I have a little bit of a divot or a scar in there where my chisel did dive. And it's not until really the very end before I put on finish that I muster up the gumption to go in and clean that out so we don't have a scar in that grain or really a tear in that grain. I really want to emphasize these small chips that you see me cutting here. That's the kind of control that I'm going for. And right there, I think, is where we start to get that tear, actually. Those big chips coming off compared to some of the smaller ones that we've been dealing with previously.
At this angle with this light, you can start to really see the area that I'm working and see a little bit of that transition. So we have the highlight on the inside of the scroll in this camera angle, and you can see that kind of fall away as we go around that scroll. And you can see here the surface that I've worked and the surface that I haven't. The surface that I've worked is much lighter, and then the surface that I haven't is still that dark colored wood there. Here I'm using that gouge more as a scraper, taking those really tiny chips as I work around that scroll. I'm doing my best here not to alter negatively, or negatively alter, I should say, that scroll, because I really like the structure that we've got. All I'm doing here with this kind of pass is trying to improve it based on some of that feedback that I was able to get at Friendship. At this point, as I'm working on the kit, I'm under a little bit of a time crunch. The CLA show where I'm supposed to deliver this muzzleloader is just a couple weeks away, but I'm hoping that I can step up this carving a little bit with those notes. So I really encourage you, if you're able to, get out there, whether in person at an event or online, and get some honest feedback and get some honest critique from some contemporary builders that know what they're doing. I think take a little criticism, take some notes, and try to improve. I know that everybody that I asked was really excited, at least, to see that I was wanting some feedback and wanting some critique. And so I at the end of it now, kind of looking back as I'm recording this, I'm really happy that I went through these extra steps. I just about doubled my carving time by coming back and doing these additional notes, but I think it really advanced the piece overall. You can see a little bit of that pencil line that I have drawn out there, kind of referencing that scroll. So the line that you see there of the area I've worked and the area I've not worked follows a pleasing arc to my eye, going from that scroll pointing back towards the toe, up through that cheek rest and down into the wrist. And that's what I'm trying to emphasize here with this material removal. I'm coming in still with that same shallow gouge. Again, I don't want to be aggressive. I'm just working around this area slowly. Comically enough, just as I speed up the footage here, but coming around that area slowly with that gouge and just removing a little bit at a time, working with the grain to give us a nice shallow scoop and a continuation of that form from the toe up into the wrist. I can't say enough about how much I enjoy working on the Kibler kits, just because of how well they're done. They snap together. They're kind of like an erector set for a mountain man, or a Lego set for a mountain man. But as I was carving on this and trying to step up my carving, I really realized how much wood there actually is for you to play with. A big point of nervousness for me through this entire process was removing too much wood, because you can never put wood back on. But working with this shallow gouge and working on the carving throughout this piece, there's really quite a bit of wood there for you to work with. I'm coming in now with a golden mean or a scrolled cabinet scraper to kind of even out a little bit of that surface. I like switching to this scraper, and you'll see me do it a few times here, because I'm able to work the entire curve basically from that cheek rest up to the comb with one tool. So in a single pass, I'm scraping that entire area, evening it up and making it nice and smooth. Not smooth necessarily as a texture, but just as a transition in the form. So you can see how much that area has changed from above the cheek rest in comparison to behind the cheek rest. In addition to some of the notes that I got and tips on how to improve this carving, I also picked up some recommended tools to go along with the improvements I'm trying to make here. So I picked up a variety of scrapers that you'll see me use. I'm back at the cabinet scraper now, but that handled scraper that I was using was made by master gun builder Dick Miller out of Michigan. He makes these and sets up at a couple shows and has them for sale. I know that he has them at Friendship, and I know that he has them at the Kalamazoo Living History Show in March each year. Using my hands a lot as I continue on this carving to kind of see what the carving looks like or what the stock looks like as far as texturally goes, and I'm using that pencil then to identify those high spots so that I can go back and target them without overworking an area. So you'll see there I've marked on either side of a space. I don't want to work that space that I didn't mark a whole lot because I don't want it to continue to go down in depth or down into the stock. I want to bring those areas on either side to the same level. Back in with the Dick Miller scraper now. This is a real transition area for the grain and the carving. So I'm kind of battling a little bit at cheek rest as well as its transition down into the scroll, and then this shallow swoop that we're putting in above the cheek rest. So it's a transition space, and I'm trying to bring it down gradually and elegantly. So I've circled this area here. I'm going to come back in with that shallow gouge to really target that area and bring it down to the same level. You could do this with a scraper, but I think it would take a really long time. And so even though this gouge isn't too aggressive, it is more aggressive than the scrapers. I'm adjusting my light here to try to get a better idea of what I'm working on. It's really nice having that adjustable arm because the lighting is really important. As I continue to work on this more and more, I realize how important lighting is, because there are things that you just simply can't see if your lighting isn't where it needs to be. It's kind of weird, but there'll be times where you just be working and working, and then you'll realize that you can't see anything. Like, for whatever reason, I don't know if it's the ambient light or if it's just the area that I was looking at it from, and it's something I've talked to other builders about, but there's just a real importance on lighting and making sure that you're adjusting the lighting to go along with what you need. It might seem kind of crazy to keep bouncing around different areas here, but I'm really fighting or really trying hard to not overwork one particular area. In my work in the past, I've had issues with getting hyper-focused on a specific area and overworking it and creating more work for myself to try to bring it back to the same level as everything else. So you'll see me moving around here, much like jumping off of the beaver tails. You see me moving around this smaller area of the composition in an effort to not overwork it. So now I'm back at that cheek rest area, kind of had a moment to think and refresh my brain, and we're back on this area. And I'm trying to have a nice defined line flow from the top of that cheek rest down into that scroll. So we have almost a trapezoid here of carving that is defined but not rigid, going from the back face of that cheek rest molding down into the scrolls. Taking a break from that part of the stock, I jumped to the underneath side of the cheek rest, and one of the notes that I got was to even this up with a scraper going perpendicular to the stock. So I have a nice wide-handled Dick Miller scraper here, and I'm just going up to underneath the cheek rest, and I'm scraping in an even pressured stroke down to that molding line. This gets to be a little tricky inside of this scroll, and I'm going to spend a lot of time working around this scroll to try to even it up. But we are able to scrape down a little bit of that hump that we had going underneath that cheek rest area. I've switched over to a narrower scraper as I continue in the same direction inside this primary scroll. And this is real gentle, real slow going here. In addition to the refining of the base level surface, I had a lot of notes on how I could refine the ends of these scrolls. So I'm using a chisel here that was forged by Ben Query under his tool company name Blue Jay Tools. This is a really small gouge, and I'm using it to come in underneath that scroll bulb to clean up the background of that scroll. What I really like about this chisel is its size. It's really small and it's a nice shallow gouge, but you'll notice that it's round on the end as well. And that makes it really handy for working around these tiny scrolls. And at this point I should mention that I'm beginning to work under magnification now for this cleanup process. This whole time beforehand, I'd kind of neglected my Optivisor, but it was one of the notes that Ben gave me about how to take this carving to the next level, was to get some magnification on so that I could really see what was going on. And I have to say, it really helped to give me a better understanding of the grain at this tiny level, and it really helped me see how to work with that grain at this kind of, it's not super tiny, but for me, it's pretty tiny. It's really hard to see with the naked eye, but with that Optivisor on, I'm able to see little tears or little peels and go in and manipulate those right away, slice them out, clean them up, and then getting outside the magnification, it just looks really clean. It's really easy to get lost in the detail that you can see at that magnified vision, but it does really help when you step back away from it and things just look a little bit cleaner. It might look pretty rough under the magnification still, but to the naked eye, I think it does look a lot better. So I'm using that same gouge as a bit of a multi-tool here on that second scroll to clean up that background and further define the verticality or the three-dimensionness of that scroll. And I'm using that gouge again here under magnification where I can really see that background better with my lighting set up right. And I'm using that to clean that up to get a more cohesive depression down into that scroll here, pointing back towards the toe. With that gouge work looking better, I come in with a rounded scraper. Again, this is a handled scraper from Dick Miller to kind of clean up that surface in the same process basically that we were doing earlier on the cheek rest with that cabinet scraper. I've roughed in and got the dimension that I want with that gouge, and then I'm coming in with this scraper to even it up, clean it up a little bit, and have a nicer refined texture. And I take that scraper as close to that scroll as I can get without bumping into the scroll, so we have a nice even transition. Now even, as you can see there, take that scraper up onto its side around that scroll to further define that verticalness of that scroll. What you don't want, and the reason why I'm going right up to the scroll with that scraper, is you don't want that nice even texture of that smooth plane that you're working to stop abruptly as you get to your scroll. You don't want it to be nice and smooth and then rough all of a sudden at your scroll. You want a similar texture and a similar finish right up to your plane changes to help keep that perception going that the carving is growing out of the stock. I'm starting to like where this is at, so it's time to jump back forward to our wrist and start executing a little bit on these beaver tails. I've got my small veining chisel again, which is the palm chisel, and I'm going to trace my drawing of these beaver tails to the best of my ability with that little palm skew. Again, I don't know if this is the best way to go about this. I know a lot of people really enjoy the stab method, where you come in with a vertical cut along your drawn lines and then come in with a cut perpendicular to that to remove the material. I really like using a V-gouge or a veiner when I can to establish that line and then come in and clean it up afterwards. Going really slow here, trying to keep one chip or one curl of material here isn't just for vanity. It is really trying to practice the idea of keeping the same pressure and the same level in my cut. So I'm trying my best to get one chip out of these cuts so that I know that I'm running level across the piece and I'm not diving in too deep. Coming along the underside now, this is a really tricky spot to work on a stock because you have the transition from the horizontal area of the barrel transitioning down into that wrist and back into the cheek area. So you have a lot of directions going that your chisel or your skew might try to run out on, but you also with that have the grain that goes along with it. Now, part of my original reason for not wanting to do the beaver tails was because I wasn't sure how to really terminate them. And I didn't think I'd have the time to do the research on how to appropriately terminate those beaver tails. But Wayne Estes, a longtime friend of the channel and a great advocate for us here, recommended that we just bring that line up to the front of the trigger guard and terminate it there. I should have had him drawn it out because since talking with Wayne, I've thought of a couple different things that he could have meant for that. But we're going to go ahead and go with our initial idea here and just bring that vein or that V-chisel cut line down underneath the wrist and up to the front inlet of that trigger guard. We're going to end up shallowing this out a little bit, removing a little bit of material so we have some definition under here, but not too much because we want to keep that trigger guard with its nice solid inlet. Back to the end of the beaver tail, I've got a nice narrow shallow gouge here. This gouge runs about the same depth as that wider gouge we've been using on the buttstock area, but this is much narrower. It's about 1/4 of an inch wide or so, and I find that it works really well for this beaver tail area where I don't want to work or hog out a wide section of material. I'm focused on a pretty narrow area of control here, and that keeps me from getting into too much trouble. I think we talked about it a little bit in the previous entry in this carving, but you'll notice that I'm carving kind of down into that veiner tool cut, and you can see that my wrist area there where my finger is on one level, and then we're diving down to our beaver tail. Our end goal with this carving is that our beaver tail is on one level and our entire wrist area is on another level, and there's a nice clean separation and a nice even transition. So we don't want our carving to, or the background I should say around our carving, to all of a sudden dip into our carving. That kind of is a beginner carving thing. I found myself doing it, and I think it's just an experience and a nervousness thing. But our end goal should always be a nice clean separation between our background and our carving. And here you can see me doing that with the skew on the underside of that beaver tail, or trying to do it, I should say. So those initial cuts were very narrow, about a 1/4 of an inch or so around that beaver tail, establishing the beaver tail. And now I'm coming in with that skew, which is a nice flat chisel designed to remove material. And I'm evening out that area so that we don't have a dip. We have a nice clean step as the goal. Back again here with that shallow, narrow gouge, using that to clean up that material. And again, maintain that nice step. So I'm running the side of that gouge in that same vein track where we cut with the V chisel, and I'm just using that gouge to clean up and flatten up that area so we have a nice clean step. I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm repeating a lot of this, but so much of this just comes down to accepting the basics and working with them, I think. You can try to think your way out of all of this as much as you want, but I think at the end of the day, it just comes down to chisel time, cutting wood to get it where you want it to be. I think you could go through and carve one of these in a day if you really wanted to, but I think if you really want it to look nice, or if you really want to push yourself, it's important to accept the limitations of time and the physical world and just go slow and steady. So here you can really see that separation as I continue to move out away from the carving, evening up those surfaces around that beaver tail. And we've got some funky grain going up into that tang area, so I begin to cut perpendicular to the grain so I have a nice clean cut to get that down to the level that I want it to be. Coming in from the forend side now, just following that grain. All of these position changes that you see, they're all solely dictated by grain of the wood. So if my chisels start to snag or dive, or they start to tear, I'm going to switch position and try to remove wood a different direction to make that a nice clean cut. It's much easier to clean up carving when you're working with the grain than it is when you're just tearing through it, hogging out material. And at this point in this kit, we're wanting to minimize those blemishes or minimize the cleanup that we have to do. We always want to be thinking about maintaining what is there and making sure that we have enough to finish things out. I know I said earlier that there's a lot of wood on these kits, and there is, but it's still easy, I think, or at least it is for me, to make a mistake. So slow and steady. This is another new chisel for me from Ben Query and Blue Jay Tools. This is a micro skew, I guess is what I would call it. It's very small, and it's just kind of a palm skew here, but the way that he's made this tool has a really short throat on it, which allows you to get in here very easily, I think, and clean up this carving. So I really like working with skews, but I was struggling before because I didn't have a skew that was really sized for working in these areas. And it's one of the reasons I picked up this chisel and all of these tools I purchased full price. You know, this isn't a promotional thing. I'm just sharing what I've found to be useful here. But that skew is really handy for getting into these areas. Now up here, forward of our tang or alongside of our tang, we've got those curves. So I'm in there with the round scraper, and then back here at the wrist, we're back to a flat scraper. Again, pushing that background to the back while trying to maintain a nice even level and keep a nice smooth surface. So with these scrapers, much like we did underneath the cheek rest, we're bringing that same technique here to the tang, where I'm scraping across the grain and I'm running between those molding lines as my barriers. It makes a nice constructive like bumper rails for us, as if you were bowling. It gives us a nice start and end for each of these scraper cuts. And as I move laterally across the stock here, you'll notice that I'm making a cut and I'm moving about 1/2 of a scraper width over. This is to maintain it, or try to maintain an even surface across the piece, and it makes it so that we're not leaving any high spots. As long as we're scraping, moving over halfway and scraping, we're always working the same area over and over again, and we're not going to have waves or ridges in there. The scrapers are like the chisels, and they are dictated by that grain structure. So there are times where I try to move perpendicular to the grain and it just isn't working, so I then run with the grain to accomplish what I'm going for. You've got to listen to that grain, and you're going to know, really, I think, regardless of your experience level, when it doesn't want to do what you're doing, because you're going to be met with resistance. I don't care how sharp your tools are. All of my tools are super sharp. I mean, super, super sharp. But I can still feel that resistance, and that tells me that I need to change up my approach. I'm trying to get this done on time, but there are things about this carving that I'm still wanting to work on. I stopped at the end of the day and I thought I was good to go on this beaver tail, but I came back the next day and I just didn't like how shallow it was. And I understand that it depends on what original piece you're looking at or what reference material you're looking at. Some of these beaver tails are super shallow. I mean, they're barely like a 32nd above the background, but I was going for a little bit more of a deeper carving. The rest of the carving on this piece was much deeper, partially due to my inexperience and continuing to carve when I shouldn't have. But I didn't want these beaver tails to feel out of place. Again, I'm thinking about this piece as a composition, and if I had to do this whole thing over again, it would look a lot different. But I don't want these beaver tails to be a real standout thing that don't fit with the rest of the carving. So I'm mixing up my technique a little bit. I'm doing a little bit of stabbing. I'm doing a little bit of cleanup. I'm using, again, that micro skew from Ben to kind of go along and define that beaver tail so that I can come in and remove the background deeper. I'm a big fan of the stop cut part of the stabbing method when it comes to carving. And so I'm using those stabbing cuts here specifically to be a stop for my scrapers. And this is where I'm evening up that wrist so that we have a nice even transition from that scroll work at the rear of the wrist up to that beaver tail at the front end of our wrist. You can see it a little bit there, I think, in the light. There's a little bit of a hump there, and we want that to be a nice straight line. Right now, if you put a ruler on that, edgewise, it would rock on that high spot of the wrist because we've removed material on both ends. So we're going to even that up, make it a nice straight transition. I'm still fighting that definition a little bit with my chisels, so I'm coming in with a carving knife here to define and slice that beaver tail out and then scrape up to it. I wasn't really happy with the scraper, so I've transitioned back to that trusty skew. I mean, skews can be difficult, they can be a pain to work with, but it's seriously one of my favorite chisels to use. With a skew, I feel like you can do just about anything. It's like a multi-tool of chisels, in my experience. And again, I'm not an expert at this. I'm just sharing my thoughts and how I approached all of this. If I had the time, I really do want to take a class someday, or a few classes, a ton of classes. It's just not on the cards right now with a young family. I've switched up my lighting, and with it I can see some changes that need to be made. So I'm back in there with that pencil, marking an area with lines perpendicular to how I see the grain running, just to help me see things. And I'm coming in with a wide scraper now and trying to flatten that area out and ease that transition from that beaver tail up into that wrist. Again, I'm going with a scrapered finish on this because I like those facets, but even with those scraped facets, there's, I think, a clean way to do it and then a little bit of a rougher way to do it. So I want all of those facets to be like a low polygon, like a 90s video game character. But I don't want like a 90s video game character. I want like a mid 2000s. So you can see there, I have narrow scraper lines going through that wrist. Changing things up again so that we don't get too focused on an area. I want to clean up the Tang carving space here, much like we did the carving behind the cheek rest. So I'm coming in with that shallow, narrow gouge with the rounded tip, and I'm working around those bulbs on those scrolls there. And you can see my optivisor has entered the frame. This really helps me in this area. I got to the point on this carving where I just felt stuck. I knew that I needed to do something, but I just could not think of, and I could not see what I needed to do. And that's where the magnification came in and really helped me out. These aren't super high powered. I think they're about a 2 to 3 times magnification. That's just enough to see these little details and again, see how that wood is behaving so that I can address it and update things and clean up this carving a little bit. I know it's not going to be a high art muzzleloader here, but I am trying to learn as I'm going along with this. This is my first carved flintlock, and I don't expect it to be my last. So I'm trying to embrace that and play with this a little bit and learn a bit along the way. At this angle now, you can see how much work we've done on the background for this scroll. Originally, this was pretty ugly, but we're starting to get a nice even transition from our wrist up into that scroll. It's a little hairy in the tight point just before that bulb, but we're getting there. And here I'm using a rounded tipped flat chisel that Ben has come up with to kind of get in there along that scroll and really flesh that out. With this, I'm able to round out the edges of that scroll a little bit, and I'm also able to work up to the base of the scroll, removing wood from the background there, evening things up in preparation for a scraper pass. Starting to really gamble a little bit here, but I want a little bit of definition on this scroll and I want it to fade out a little bit. So I'm removing some material with that skew to round out this scroll a little bit and lessen the contrast or the drasticness of the contrast between the background and that scroll. I want it to be a little bit more organic, so I'm just shaving off small angles around that scroll with that skew. The skew is really handy for this background removal because of its width. It's narrow enough to be useful inside intricate carving, but with it we're also able to slice off a broad stroke between our background and our carving, again evening that transition so we have a nice clean step, or a cleaner step than we did before. Looking back on the design for this Tang, I should have done a lot of things differently, but you don't know unless you try. The primary thing that I wish I would have done is I wish I would have made that primary leaf coming back past those scrolls much wider. I think I could have taken them out to the width of those scrolls or just a slightly narrower, maybe by 1/8 of an inch, and brought it back out to that point. And I think I would have been better off aesthetically. It would have had a more traditional look to it. I think we're a little bit narrow, and that narrowness gave me some difficulty. So that's something I would recommend if you're looking at this carving and considering something like it. Don't be afraid to make that leaf area wider. It's at this point where I'm spending a lot of time looking at this carving that I'm realizing one of my earlier mistakes, and I didn't follow my layout guidelines well enough, and I feel like I've got a little bit of an imbalance there on that leaf. It's not something that I'm going to be bold enough to address until later, but we'll come back to that in a little bit. But for now, we're going to lay out the beaver tail on our lock plate side. I'm doing my best to match this up using those reference guidelines that we drew around the wrist previously, and I'm trying my best to get a similar shape and design really with all of this, similar width and a similar length. So not happy with that first iteration, so I'm coming back in and drawing some more reference lines, trying to give myself the skeletal structure of this drawing that I need so that I can lay out this carving properly. And I think looking back on it, looking at more reference now, I could have done a taller, fatter beaver tail. But again, I was trying to follow the design philosophy that I already established with this kit, where I had narrower, longer leaves or leaf elements through this. So I wanted these beaver tails to match or try to match in theme the proportions and the layout of our Tang carving. So I wanted those 3 notes to be a triptych for this. And again, I think I could have done it differently and it would have looked better, but I wanted these beaver tails to fit in. So there's always the next kit, there's always the next muzzleloader, and it's part of the process to embrace the learning and the imperfections. As I'm making these cuts, I'm going to overshoot the end of the beaver tail here because all of this material is going to be cleaned up later. So with both of these cuts, both on the top and bottom side of the beaver tail, I'm going to overshoot it, remove that material so we have a nice clean point. I think of all the areas on this stock, as far as carving goes, the underside of the beaver tails here in the wrist were some of the gnarliest grain structure, because we had the curl and we had the transition stepping us down into the wrist in the buttstock area. So I'm fighting tears here. I'm using a skew to try to float through the grain and cut it, but you see it's still hanging up there. We have a big tear there in the back we're going to have to go and address behind my hand, but we'll come back to that and move on. Here I'm taking that palm skew up on end, and I'm using it to create a stop cut and clean up the vertical face of the inlet there. From there, I can come back with the skew and work back towards that line, using it again as my stop cut so that I'm not going to risk tearing it out. And come along with my carving knife now and address that big tear we had previously. All I'm going to do is come in from the opposite direction and work my blade in until I'm at the same level and just peel that shaving right off. And I'm just going to continue back a little bit, address a couple more of those tears, and then come in with that skew and clean up that vertical line. I'm rolling that skew to create a nice straight line, or try to. Looking back on it, I feel like I could have done a better job at this area of the stock. I don't know what was going on. For me, I don't know if maybe I was getting flustered by the grain structure here or what. But as much as I tried to keep it nice and clean, it is a little wibbly wobbly. With the underside cleaned up a little bit, I'm coming back to the beaver tail itself to start removing its background. I'm coming in with that palm skew. This isn't the tiny one. This is kind of just our regular palm skew. And I'm working on removing the initial level of material. So I'm running that skew, the tip up against that stop cut so that we're not cutting into our beaver tail, but we're just working right along it and using that stop cut to clean things up and keep us in line. It's really satisfying when you have an area like this where you can make that stop cut and you can just remove the background as easily as this is going. There are some parts of this that are really difficult, but there's some parts of this that just flow like butter. And this area, for whatever reason, the flow of the grain structure and me being right-handed, this space just really works well. And we're able to come in here and really cleanly and really quickly remove that background without a whole lot of effort. Coming in from the other side now, lining my skew, as you can see there, kind of in line with the curve of that beaver tail and working right up to my stop cut, removing that background. Just gentle slices, just feeling for tears. I'm not going fast, I'm not going hard. Just nice, easy cuts as we're working with that grain. Here in this wrist area, I want that beaver tail to be pronounced, and I want the background to fall away and evenly transition down into that toe molding line that we've established. Now you can see here, I didn't have great line confidence with my drawing, so I'm fighting a little bit of indecisiveness as to where this beaver tail actually goes, but I'm keeping to the outer line, as you can see it there, until I'm sure I want to go in to that inner line if I do end up doing that. See, with that skew, I can just bring it right around and clean up those chips on the side of even that rounded beaver tail. A lot of people seem to find the skew to be an intimidating tool, but it's seriously one of my favorite tools ever. And for something like this, where you have not only curly grain, but you have changes in grain direction so much as we go through this wrist, the skew is just so utilitarian. So I'm using it now to go on the inside of that curve and just clean up some errant chips we had there. Just going to gently push that forward up into that carving and then we'll come in off the top and slice it out, pop it out, and move on. While I was doing it, this part felt very slow and very tedious, but I continued working on it. I think I spent more time on this Tang area of this muzzleloader than any other part of it, but I spent so much time here because it is such a personal space on the muzzleloader, on the composition of this. I mean, as soon as you grab this piece, your hand is right there in this area. Your eye is immediately drawn to this carving. The lock is there, the side plate is there, and you have your barrel tang there as well. So this is a part that you're looking at almost all the time. you can say what you want about the patch box area or the area behind the cheek piece, and we spent a lot of time there, and historically those are the real canvases of these pieces. But in today's sense, I guess, if you're going to go out and use this particular piece in the way that it's intended, you're going to spend a lot more time looking at and feeling the tang and wrist area, way more than you are any other space on the piece. And so that's why I'm spending so much time here and really focusing in on these plane changes as we go from that tang carving down to our lock border carving here. It seems inconsequential, it seems like a small detail, but looking back on it now, I'm glad we spent so much time in this particular area. And that's something I would recommend to anybody building or carving their first muzzleloader or considering carving a muzzleloader, is when in doubt, take the time and spend the extra time on those areas. It's a lot easier to do it now before it gets finished and before you get out in the woods with it than it is to try to make the time to remove the finished work you've already done to correct something like this. Back up here at the fore end of our tang, I have a lot of work to do on both sides here. This was a tricky area before, and now we're adding more detail to it with these beaver tails and this molding going around our lock mortise. So I'm coming in with that narrow, shallow gouge again with the round tip, and I'm using this to just remove that material. You can see across my pencil lines there, we have a couple plane changes that we're still dealing with. So I'm going up to the breech area here, and I'm working my way back to that wrist. The way the grain structure is going, it makes sense or cuts better for me to work from the fore end back than it does the back end forward. This way I'm cutting the wood and I'm not tearing and diving into the grain. So I've got these narrow chisels. This is part of Ben's set from Blue Jay Tools. And I'm using these to very gently go through and remove this material. I tried doing this with scrapers. It was working, but it wasn't as effective as I needed it to be. It was very slow going. And I think that the sharpness of the chisels and be able to remove a little bit more wood ended up helping me because I was able to actually see the changes that we were making and see actual progress, which at this point in the build was important because it felt like we'd been at this stage in this kit for months. And at this point, I guess we were. So that's what's kind of crazy about it. I think in total, I had about 60 hours in the carving from start to finish. And I think that can seem like a lot, but it was my first time doing something like this. I think I would be able to do this exact same carving faster next time because I learned a lot and I figured out how to do things that I should or shouldn't do. So I know how to avoid the things that I shouldn't do, and I know better approaches to the other means to do stuff. So that's, I think, just part of, again, that learning process and trying to embrace that learning process. This is a really easy kit to put together. It snaps together, like I said. I had it together and ready to go in under 2 hours. I think in our first video I had mentioned all this carving and things. This is just extra details because I'm wanting to challenge myself and play with a few things artistically. So I'm establishing that narrowest part of this wrist here, because up in that bulb we want to scoop that out a little bit so it's a little bit concaved on either side, just to give it a little bit of a different texture and make it reflect light a little bit differently. Again, that's one of those details that was recommended as a more advanced thing to do. I think in the end, looking back on it, we were able to do it a little bit, but I think we could have done it a little bit better had we gone into the carving knowing we were going to do that at the start rather than trying to pass it in at the end. So I'm using this flat chisel here to run along our lock plate mortise and our beaver tail lines there. Then I'm coming in with that micro skew to kind of even out that material. So we're running left and right here from that molding from our beaver tail over to our Tang carving, just evening that out. You can see we're just cutting through a ridge right there. That nice wide blade evens that out. I'm up at the fore end now of that Tang carving, and I'm using that rounded scraper to kind of flatten this out a little bit and start to concave that space. This, again, was a really tricky area. If you looked at this stock from the side, you'd see that this tricky area is the same grain as the tricky area underneath the lock plate mortise that we've been fighting. So this is a really curly section of this stock. This curl doesn't run all the way through. It kind of runs in patches, and it just so happens to run right here at the Tang, which makes doing this kind of carving a little bit difficult because we're running into those hills and valleys of that curly grain. So we've got the scraper. Now we're coming in with our, I think that's our veiner, our V chisel, to clean up those walls a little bit, get those established a little bit tighter so we can come in and remove more of this background. Now the breech area is really important for a muzzleloader or any arm. I know some people out there have expressed concerns about removing this much wood, and I do think I removed a little too much wood. I think our Tang carving could look a little bit nicer if it was a little shallower, but I'm not concerned from a safety perspective with this amount of wood. There's just not enough there to really matter. Then coming back to the technique that we've used before, I'm using that flat scraper to cut perpendicular to the grain to even out that transition a little bit more. You can see up there in that curve at the fore end of the breech, we're still fighting a little bit of that grain there, but we're going to try to come in with this scraper and even that out a little bit. The scraper is really handy here running perpendicular because we're able to get into that really narrow section that we're having trouble getting to with our chisels. Now I'm going to come in with our skew perpendicular and clean up that small ridge that you can see there. Trying to complete that transition into that molding line. For whatever reason, it was too difficult to get that with the scraper, or we were just enhancing that bump a little bit. that skew, we can just come in there and chop that ridge off. So again, we have a nice flat approach to that carving and that raised relief. I'm going to speed this up a little bit, but we're coming in with that rounded small gouge. I don't really know. I guess we could have come in there with different tools, but that rounded gouge just really worked well getting in there and cleaning things up. And then back here at the tail end of our beaver tail, I'm coming in with that micro skew, and we're working on the transition and the approach to that beaver tail. So that wrist is the same level as the beaver tail right now, and we want to push that approach back so it's transitioning over 4, 5, 6 inches instead of like half an inch. And I started with the skew, as you could see, but now we're transitioned back over to that carving knife because I'm able to work a wider section and it's a little bit sharper, and the profile lends itself well to control, to keep things or keep the cut from diving in the grain. That's the tricky part, like I've mentioned before about these wrists, is you're dealing with a lot of grain differences. And I've just got one right there where I had that dive. So I'm coming in from the opposite direction, and I'm just shaving off small amounts until I'm down to that same level, and we can just slice it right off. I don't want to get into that position where I have a dive and a tear going and just rip it out. There's no telling where that tear is going to go, how deep it's going to go, or how far forward it's going to go. So by stopping the cut, flipping over and approaching it from the opposite direction, we're able just to cut it off nice and clean and have a nice even transition. We're getting to the point now where our definition is there, and we just need to start cleaning things up. So I've got Dick Miller's scrapers back out, and I'm going to be transitioning or switching it up between a couple different sizes of flat scrapers, working in a couple different directions or orientations, but we're using these to clean up some of those chisel marks, even things out, flatten them out a little bit. We're not going to make it perfect, both because we're running out of time and we have limited skill. And sometimes you can't clean everything up. And on this underside, I'm not super worried about it being perfect. I'm happy with where our beaver tails are and happy where our wrist is at. So I'm going to focus on those areas and not focus so much on the area underneath our trigger guard. So I'm coming in, I'm working backwards to forwards here with the scraper. I'm working to remove those pencil lines, and I've put those pencil lines there because I see or feel some kind of ridge there that I don't want there. And there you can see those pencil lines are gone, and with it the same ridge. So I'm running perpendicular to the grain of the stock, much like we were underneath the cheek rest, and using this scraper to even things up. Now I'm using a narrower flat scraper here because my full width flat scraper is a little too wide, and I found that it would run into on the edges it would run into the curves on either side, or the stock on the other side, leaving some nasty lines in there. So here you can see I have a couple guidelines marked out as we work back towards the toe. The first one that I'm running to is one ridge line that was left over from where we cut in that molding line and when we cleaned and defined that up. So I'm working to scrape through that so that we even that up, and then we've got another line up there as well. We'll end up scraping through from above that line down to our toe molding to even this up. And that's just an aesthetic choice, really. I tried to slender this thing up just a little bit underneath those areas to give it the impression or give it the look that it was a little bit lighter than it actually was. By narrowing that up, I think we lose a little bit of that bulk and it makes it look a little sleeker. Still not quite happy with that Tang transition into the wrist. You can see with all those pencil lines, I've marked out some facets, but I'm going over and working this area with this scraper, as you can see here. And we're using that same technique of running perpendicular to the grain. And I'm starting and ending each of these cuts a little bit overlapped. So I'm going a little bit farther than I need to, just to make sure that we're running as far as we need to. I don't want to leave a gap or a ridge in here up against this carving, so I'm going from carving to carving really with this scraper to clean things up. And you can see there that transition already at 300% speed here. However, we're able to clean that up, get rid of some of those ridges, and have a nice smooth transition. It gets a little bit trickier here up in front of this scroll because we get into such a tight area, but we've got a couple narrower scrapers we're going to transition to, or switch out to, I should say. And like this rounded scraper, this isn't a concave area that we're working there back by that scroll, but that narrow scraper, or that round scraper, is narrow at that pinnacle of that curve, and that makes that nice and easy for us to work those spaces. Backing up here, we're making some real progress. We're back to the flat scraper behind our carving. We're just putting kind of the finishing touches here on that transition from the Tang carving into that wrist. Now we get to do it on the other side as well, and I'll spare you a lot of that because we've been scraping and cutting here for quite a long time. But this is just slow going, and I think the name of this game really is just patience and how far do you want to take it. I'm not saying that this is perfect by any means, but I am happier with it now than I was when we started cutting these beaver tails. I do think it adds a lot. I think it looks a lot nicer, gives us some more detail, and I really learned a lot along the way. Back here on the comb, I've paid attention to some of the other Woodsrunners I've seen being built, and in particular, the Woodsrunners by Wayne Estes have a nice crisp line on the top of the comb, or on the sides of the comb before they transition to the top. So I'm trying to put a little bit of that here. I want a little bit of definition here. It's not necessarily matching with the original Woodsrunner, but I think with the scrapered finish that we're going, adding that line in there gives it a nice look. Back up here in the Tang, still trying to refine that concaved area. We've got some narrow scrapers, and then we're cleaning up a little bit of the top. I don't know that we needed to do that, but I think just spending a lot of time working this area, you start to see things that you want to improve. So here I'm back with that round scraper on the side plate side, trying to get that cleaned up. We're back with a flat scraper now, working in line with the grain, cleaning that up a little bit. It's funny, the lock plate side, or the lock side, the cutting was easier on that side, but it was easier to get a finish that I liked in a transition from the Tang to the wrist. It was easier on the side plate side. I don't know what that is about it. The side plate side went really smoothly despite being a little more difficult. So I don't know if maybe it being more difficult slowed me down and made it so our cuts were conscious cuts. There weren't any just mindless cuts in there, which made it easier to clean up. I don't know. But it was a lot easier to clean up. Just a lot of scraper work, as you can see, and we'll transition into the skews a little bit more as we get back into this wrist, but it just really worked out well, and I'm glad Wayne Estes he actually recommended that we put in the beaver tails and pushed pretty hard for it, and I'm really glad that we came home and did it. Here you can see that beaver tail. It doesn't look super defined, but we have sloped either side of that beaver tail a little bit just to smooth it out. I didn't want that to be super pronounced. But it is more pronounced than it looks from this angle, because from this angle you're only getting that highlight on that pretty short vertical face there, but that beaver tail does come up a little bit as you arc up and over. It's about time to take a break from those beaver tails, so I'm coming back to the patch box area, and we're working on cleaning up those ridges. You can see the difference there as we're scraping. We just have some funky lines going on there, and bringing that scraper up to where our patch box is with the patch box back in there gives us a nice stop so that we're not removing material from underneath that patch box. We can keep that nice tight tolerance, but we can have a nice smooth transition around the stock. This is really nice. I really enjoyed this part of it. There was something simple about it that you didn't have to be super focused or super worried, but you're able to work through and make some good progress quickly, which feels good after spending so much time in one specific area like the Tang. I did end up coming in with a little bit of a file there because I was working on my butt plate. My order of operations, I think, on this kit was a little goofed up because I was so excited about getting to the carving. There was some hardware fitting things I think I just glossed over, getting in a hurry, getting excited about doing something new. So we're back in with that file, evening this up a little bit with that butt plate so we have a nice match. Now I'm in with that curved cabinet scraper, that French curved cabinet scraper, and I'm working on defining a little bit of that wrist transition into the buttstock. I wanted that to be a little bit more pronounced. And then back over here on the side plate side, I'm using that scraper from the back end forward, cleaning up a little bit of that carving transition from those flutes into that beaver tail. So we've done this on the other side, and now we're just coming to this side, cleaning things up, making sure they match, making sure they look good, because people are going to spend a lot of time looking at this side of the stock because of that carving that we have around the cheek piece. So we want these transitions to be nice, if not a little bit nicer than the lock side. Not that we want things to be out of balance, but there's going to be a lot of pause on this side, I think. Much like our other side, I'm working on that crisp line. I'm working on that transition from the wrist into the cheek rest area here, making it a little bit more pronounced with this round scraper. The French curve scraper, I was nervous about it running into our scrolls, so I just opted for the slower, smaller scraper here. At this point, I'm just going around this rear section of the stock and just doing general cleanup. I'm identifying little areas that I want to flatten out or smooth out, and I'm trying to target those, just rotating the stock as much as I can in the light, looking at it from different angles. Here I've got a straight edge, checking that wrist a little bit, seeing how we look, and then coming in with that French curve scraper, identifying some high points and just wiping them right out. Up here at a ramrod entry pipe, I'm using that rounded gouge again to clean up a little bit of this incised carving line. Again, it's not perfect, but we're enjoying the process and learning a lot. So here I'm just taking that gouge, that curve, and we're just cleaning up some of those small shavings in there. And as I've been doing this, I'm preparing to work on the molding lines that are going to run along the ramrod channel. So I want this to be a nice transition from these lines over to the Forestock molding. I marked a line with a pencil and a ruler earlier on the Forestock here, aligning with either the barrel pins or the ramrod pipe pins. I can't remember off the top of my head right now, but I made it so that we had a nice even line all the way down this fore end, and I'm coming in with that V chisel with this single cut, doing my best to maintain a level and pressure across the whole fore end here so that we have a nice established line to work to. Now, much like the wrist area, our fore end has a lot of curl to it, so the cleanup portion really of this molding line is going to get a bit tricky, but we're going to do our best to make it nice and clean. So here back at the entry pipe, I want to make that a nice transition. from that incised line down to that molding, so we'll have to remove a little material there before we move on. And here we are on the side plate side doing the same thing, trying to make one long cohesive cut along this ramrod molding. Here's some of that material removal as we try to work on that transition. I think what got me here was those flowing lines, those incised lines going back along the side of the entry pipe. Something about the dimension of those kind of threw this a little bit, but with this skew, we're able to get in here and remove a little bit of that background. Then along this molding, I'm coming in with that skew and using that initial V chisel cut as our stop cut. But here's where that curl starts to mess with me a little bit. I'm coming in with that skew, trying to cut across the grain, and I'm just finding it start to tear. So we're going to go through a couple different processes here on this forestock area to get it cleaned up. I would have really liked it if it had all just been the skew, but we're going to bounce around between our skews and scrapers. Here at the fore end, we get away from that curl a little bit, and you can see that just cut like butter, which is really nice. Able to hog that material out efficiently, and it feels good too. When you have good cuts like this and good tools, I think it just feels good. You can just know that it's working well, and you know that you're kind of on easy street, which after, I don't know, like 30 inches of it being slow going, it finishing out nicely and cutting like butter at the end was a nice consolation prize. We're going to use the same process on both sides. After I've got the initial cuts in here, we're going to go over to the side plate side or the lock plate side and do the same exact thing where we cut down to that line. But then I find that my line isn't as straight as I'd like it to be, so I start to come in with my file here. I'm using a half round, but you could use just a mill file or a rectangular file. I'm using this file to kind of clean up this line a little bit, trying to straighten it out. And in the end, I think I ended up with a little bit of a tapered line, being wider at the rear and a little narrower at the front, but I don't think it looks too bad. It's not perfect by any means, but it's more of an abstract detail, I think. It's not necessarily something that your eye is drawn to constantly, like the Tang wrist and the cheek piece. So that's how I rationalize it, at least. I say that it's not a focal point, and the eye is traveling through the piece, and it's not stopping necessarily to take a look at the ramrod molding. To match the finish, I come back in with our scraper. So we have those nice scraper facets and we don't have any file marks. I'm trying to negate those file marks as much as I can. But as you can see here, sometimes you just got to go back in with that file and true things up a little bit. And here I experiment a little bit with a checkering tool to see if that can define that line a little bit more. I have some success and then I have some failure with that. There are times where that checkering tool would grab the curl and bounce up and out of my channel. But I think it is a good means to kind of hog that out quickly or get a baseline going quickly for you. Some of these areas where I fought tears, I get a knife file out. This is kind of named after the shape of the file, so it's pointed a little bit like a knife, but then it's also triangular on the horizontal axis, which made it really nice for working along this molding. And then to get rid of that file mark, oh, see, I got a little bumble there with my scraper. I come in with my scraper and try to clean things up. So we have a nice faceted texture there. While your eye might not spend a lot of time in this area, depending on where it's at, your hands will. And I didn't want there to be a weirdly smooth, untextured area from a sandpaper or file. So I really relied on the scrapers to kind of balance out the feel. Here we're working that transition a little bit more, trying to bring that as a gradual drop off around that top scroll there, or incised line, I should say. I want it to come around that curve and just fall off immediately down into that ramrod channel for a smooth transition. I keep saying smooth transition. If you've made it this far, I hope you've not taken a shot or eaten a piece of chocolate every time I say smooth transition, because you're probably gaining a lot of weight or you're sleeping on the floor. I really love scrapers and I love a scrapered finish, but there's absolutely a skill to it. You can see there we hung up quite a bit on some of these, and you'll see in the finished piece there's some nicks and dings. Here we are with that knife file again. I'm working on the transition at the fore end. So we've tapered off that molding where the ramrod kind of enters and connects with the stock. So I'm using that knife file to follow our molding around and smooth out the transition, once again, ding, 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 between the stock, the molding, and our nose cap. Because we've permanently affixed our nose cap, we can't do anything to remove it at this point, but it does allow us to get a nice connection between the wood and the metal. And I'm using fairly fine files here for that process. And here we are cutting a little extra on the other side, getting it started so we can finish it out the same way that we've just finished out the side plate side. A lot of my process on this kit has been to do the off side first and then do the primary side. So I did a lot of work on the side plate side first before doing the lock side on everything kind of on the fore end. Now, when it comes to the cheek rest and the carving around the cheek rest, you can't really do that from the other side. But like we talked about in the first video about the carving here, I saved a lot of that for the last part of that carving session because I knew that I needed a little experience to build up to it. So I didn't go into the main focal point first. I got my feet wet a little bit, learned a little bit about this particular stock that I was using before jumping in.
I know that was another long video. I really appreciate everybody sticking around to see how I approach this. It's becoming a little more difficult to do these kinds of videos on YouTube because it seems like there's some question on whether or not we should be allowed to upload a video like this. So I'm hoping that we can continue to do simple videos like this and share some of the things that I'm learning along the way and share some of the notes that I'm getting from some of the contemporary masters I'm able to talk to. All of that being said, we're in the home stretch now, and as I'm recording this, the Woodsrunner kit is done. So it's now just down to editing down the hours and hours and hours of footage, getting the narration recorded and getting it out to you. So we're going to see that in the next few weeks. I hope that you've enjoyed this process, and I hope you enjoy seeing what we do with this final product.